It is a great pleasure to begin our second panel of this morning's sessions by introducing to the stage a man of immense distinction, a man who throughout his career has propagated the causes of freedom, of liberty, and of association between the Western democracies, the former President and Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, Václav Klaus. And in a change to the program, this session will be moderated by the Danube Institute's Director of Research, Dr. David Martin-Jones. And that conversation will then be followed by Dr. Neven Vidakovic and Catherine McBride of the UK Trade and Agricultural Commission. So may I ask you please all to give a warm welcome to President Václav Klaus.
All right, if people could take their seats, it would be helpful, I think. So this session, we're dealing with geoeconomics, the way in which the West has dealt or not dealt with financial issues really since the financial crisis going back to 2008. And then the results of the COVID relief programs that led to huge debt situations across the Western economies, an ultra-loose monetary policy, then followed by rapid escalation in interest rates, has left us bemused and bewildered. I'm here at the moment as a replacement for Gerard Baker, who's got COVID. But as a result of him having COVID, I'm here. But the world hasn't closed down. It did in 2020. So something obviously has changed. And to shed light on the way we've mismanaged our economies since really the 2010s, I hand over to the former President and Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, who did so much to get the Czech Republic going after 1990, and I think he now thinks it's not going so well, as is the rest of the European Union. So over to you, Mr. President.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for inviting me again and for giving me the floor. Just two comments. I understood that everyone was interested in Russia and Ukraine, which means the first panel, and now most of the people left the room, which is okay. I think they are right, because I will not speak about Ukraine or Russia, and because I don't think that the problems of the world economy are connected with Ukraine and Russia. This is my very strong statement, starting point. And second, the introduction was very nice, that I was very influential in bringing the Czech Republic, then Czechoslovakia, on board, on transforming the country. That it was, at that time, country was functioning very well. Now it's not functioning. The answer is very simple, because I am not there in the highest political positions. This is very simple logic, which should be applied, I suppose, not in the current Czech media, definitely. So let me start with three short remarks to make sure I am well understood. First, I would like to say that the topic is called geoeconomics. I must again protest. I think it's a wrong term. Geoeconomics is a fashionable term these days. It pretends that it's based on a well-established theory which it is not. Economics is a serious scientific discipline. Geoeconomics is not. John, I would suggest to forget this term. Second, it's always difficult to find the approach, the attitude, the dimension how to speak. I'm always afraid that with this panel on economic issues, everyone was just try to give advice to somebody. I must say that in the communist era, I was not asked to give advice. So no. In the post-communist era, I was most of the time Minister of Finance, Prime Minister, and President of the country, so I was supposed to get advice. So I must say that I don't have the mentality of an advisor. I'm afraid that many people do it. And third point, speaking about politics, economics, I come from a small country with no geopolitical ambitions. It's necessary to say. From a country that by joining the EU lost its short era of independence and sovereignty, which we enjoy immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Empire. We are in the EU now, but Europe is a very weak source of identity for us. That's why I don't possess an authentic European way of thinking, really, not to speak about possessing European ambitions. So that was the introduction, methodological introduction. A few words to our topic. It's very difficult to generalize. The world is fragmented, not homogeneous, plus all of us are inevitably biased because of our vested interests. The only generally valid idea about the current era is that there is a huge geopolitical and economic uncertainty. That's for me one clear thing that is undermining economic growth. And the slow growth and slower growth is and will be, with all what it means, it will be a global phenomenon for a visible, foreseeable future. Let me focus my comments on the West. I fear for its fate. It seems problematic and unwarranted now. In our institute in Prague, we have just completed a small book, a collection of essays with the title, The Self-Destruction of the West. I really have to repeat, it's not about the destruction of the West, it's about its self-destruction. This slow but powerful process is not a consequence of an external shock, pressure, threat, or anything like that. It has, of course, not fallen from the sky. We are convinced that it is a self-made, self-imposed, self-inflicted injury. It has not been imported from the East or from the South. It has not been imposed on us from somewhere. Neither is the outcome of a diabolical plan of a group of crazy conspirators who want to destroy the world as we know it. This process seems to me to be the consequence of an endogenous mechanism. It's the outcome of an evolutionary process based both on ideologies and interest, as always in the human history. The Western society has been intentionally getting rid of its basic pillars, which were the source of its success and prosperity in the past. Individual freedom and free markets have become disgraced. No one is defending them because of the strengths of the current prevailing dominant ideologies. Their defense is considered politically incorrect, more or less reactionary. To advocate them, as I recently tried 2 weeks ago at a major international conference in the south of Europe somewhere, I tried, it was not welcome, even though many participants congratulated me silently, ex post, for having the courage to raise these issues. Some of us, I don't know how many, some of us were used to live in such a world for a very long time. It asked for courage and resolution to express criticism of the official ideology in the communist era. We didn't expect, however, to return to something similar to that so quickly. I have to announce, John, that Melissa was the first to applaud. You know, that's a very meaningful message. Thank you, Melissa. The new ideologies of aggressive environmentalism, multiculturalism, genderism, NGOism, or in the field of economics, of such a nonsense as the extreme version of post-Keynesianism, called the new monetary theory, have been promoted, heralded, and consequently more or less smoothly accepted as a new orthodoxy. This is beyond my understanding. I just a few days ago come across in the International Economy, the American Quarterly, a piece written by Nobel Prize winner Joseph Stiglitz, my arch enemy for 3 decades. You know, Klaus Schwab in Davos usually organized a debate between two of us in Davos because he enjoyed the arguments. He was, of course, totally on the other side than me. Nevertheless, he wanted to hear it. So I will, and Stiglitz published an article with the title, we just discussed it, Inflation, Indebtedness, growing state deficit, budget deficit, and so on. The title of Stiglitz is What That? It seems to me fascinating. He is in favor of that. So this is definitely the new monetary theory. So I will try to make a few points I see important in this topic. The autonomy of the economy has been in the West reduced in a way and scale that the current reality can be compared to the communist era, where the economy was run by a powerful central authority. You know, it was difficult to discuss this issue in the communist era with the title Down with the Communist Party. It was possible to argue in favor of the greater autonomy of the economic system, not to be dictated by politics. Half a century ago, people like me used this argumentation and used to argue that the politics shouldn't go ahead of the economy and that economy needs an elementary autonomy. To debate the autonomy of the economy was somehow possible. Central planners didn't want to hear it, but the debate was becoming, as a consequence of more and more visible deficiencies of the economy, possible at that time. Today, any debate with the Greens is impossible. They and their apologists in all political parties don't pay attention to arguments. Plus, the penalty when you openly disagree with them is similar now to that we experienced in the late communist era. I stress late communist era. I don't speak about the 1950s or 1930s in Soviet Union. You are simply not promoted and you don't get the government grants. That's the penalty these days, similar with the communist Czechoslovakia in the 1980s. I say again, not in the 1950s. So you don't get government grants. Now, especially the EU grants, which some of us would never accept anyway. So that's not such a loss. So the autonomy of the economy disappeared. Second, the economy has been damaged by the enormous amount of subsidies of all kinds. Communism, with its suppression of markets and distortion of prices, was inevitably based on subsidies. One of the main slogans of our transformation era was, therefore, desubsidization. We had, in my transformation program, we have 4 points: liberalization, deregulation, desubsidization, and privatization. The 4 points, all 4 of them were of the same importance, I would say. I'm afraid that the time has come to return to the slogan desubsidization again. Third, the economy is once again overregulated with all kinds of external standards imposed upon it. A specific role is played by ridiculous green imperatives, recently under the banner ESG, Environmental Social Governance. Running corporations for the benefit of shareholders is out. Together, it doesn't mean anything but a fundamental systemic change. People still blindly believe they live in a capitalist system and a market economy. This is not true. My 4th point. Economic agents are overtaxed. It shifts their position on the supply curve. They decrease their efforts rationally. Plus, when taxes are not large enough, the government expenditure are funded either by deficit financing or by inflation, as is the case just now. A debilitating, vicious circle starts inevitably. And final point, number 5, the managerial revolution of the 1950s has been completed. The managers and technocrats have become, to some people, surprisingly, the main fighters for a non-economic way of thinking. This shouldn't be surprising. This shouldn't be surprising. They always had, and have even now, totally different interests than the owners. Just we don't stress it sufficiently, in my understanding. Some take it as something given, but it must be repeated and discussed. So I will stop very soon. These and many other characteristics of the contemporary economy are relevant for the whole world and are promoted by internationalists all over the world, but their main domain is the West. I always quote one of my heroes, Aldous Huxley, and his Brave New World. This January, I put together a small book of my speeches with the title Brave New West. I think it's relevant. I brought a box of copies of that. Who wants can get it after it. So we who are here instinctively feel that the world we live in and its geoeconomics, whatever it means, is fundamentally wrong. And we should be saying that loudly. In the program booklet we got, I discovered the question, can stability be restored? Someone put that question in the program booklet. My answer is, hopefully in 2223 maybe, when John and Melissa will still organize the conference. But it will ask for a systemic change, for the change of the prevailing system of beliefs and of the pattern of sorts. So optimism is an obligation, but we must be aware of what it asks for. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, that was fascinating insight into how we've arrived at where we are, the brave new West that hath such creatures in it. Thank you very much. I will review it. So in terms of the self-destructive path we followed, we now have Catherine and Nevin to take us forward on this journey. So we go with Catherine. Okay, Nevin Vidakovic, who doubles as a bond trader as well as being an adjunct fellow at the Institute, will give us his insight into how far the West has declined and will it decline even further? Over to you, Nevin.
Well, considering that I'm short bonds, I most certainly hope so. Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm honored to be on the same stage with Professor Klaus. You don't share a stage with Professor Klaus. You're honored to be on the same stage with him. Obviously, my new boss, head of research, Professor David Jones, and then Madam McBride. It's interesting. Both of them, I'm a professor of monetary policy. Professor Klaus used to be a professor of monetary policy. I'm a trader. Madam McBride was also a trader. So both of them went into diplomacy. I wonder what's going to happen with me. I'm happy to be here. As a leaflet says, I'm a non-resident fellow. I'm from Croatia. So basically, when I come here, I look at this as a kind of a castle I have in another country. And my 4-year-old daughter asked me, what are you doing? And I said, I'm going to Hungary. And she says, what are you going to do there? And I said, there's a meeting of superheroes. And your father is a superhero. So I would like to welcome all the other superheroes from Heritage Foundation and from all corners of the globe that came here and listened to me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to provide a transactional microeconomic account of what happened and why did we get here. To a large extent, this follows what Mr. Anton talked about, a deal with China. So we're going to see how that deal with China occurred and how it transformed the economy than we know today. Now, there are several years in the economy where you have structural breaks. You know, something happens and the nature, the way economy functions simply shifts. So one of them, the most famous one is, for example, 1929. Another one that I put is 1921. So in 21, economy as we knew it from 1980, simply ceased to exist. So we're now in a deglobalization and polarization state of the economy, not just the world, but the way each economy functions. So here's another thing. The way most of you look at inflation is, by definition, it's a change of price. You know, something used to cost 100 euros, now it's 110. I don't look at inflation like that. I look at inflation over a long period of time. And if you look at inflation over 20, 30 years, then inflation trend provides you with an answer to this question. What does it tell you about the state of the economy? And the answer is everything. So let's look at the inflation. Now, this is what is known as a core inflation. So there's no food, there's no energy, because those are highly volatile. And it's US, and it's split between core goods and core services. Now look at what is happening here. You have core goods, which are almost from, this is from 2001, which is where I get the data from New York Fed, they're almost all the time negative or deflationary. This is China. This is globalization. So because Chinese are producing more cheaper goods, for us, the price of goods is decreasing. Now, as a benefit or as a consequence, it depends how you look at it, production moved from United States to China. So this was a win-win because Americans got cheaper goods and Chinese got new jobs and their economy was allowed to grow. Now, a lot of people said, in the 80s, oh, we're destroying our manufacturing jobs. There won't be any jobs for Americans. The Americans will, be impoverished. Well, that's not true because you have core services. The price of services is always positive, meaning that economy shifted from production of goods to production of services, and all the people in services started to get higher jobs, better paying jobs and a better state of living. So this is the global transformation of globalization. Asia got production, specifically China, got economic growth. United States also got economic growth in a different kind of jobs. Well, the problem is, if you have something positive and something negative, you can't generate huge growth. That's why people talk about, the lost decade or the growth rates are decreasing. They have to decrease because if your services are growing, for example, 4% annually, and your production of goods is decreasing by 2%, you're basically having a 2% growth. The math is more complex, but just involved. What happened in 21? Oh, this happened. So you see how the inflation spiked and it stayed up. So what we have today, it's not a question of will inflation slightly decrease? It already has. The question is where it will stop. And the way things are looking, it stopped at 5%. So to go down to a 2% inflation or no inflation, which is what we had for these 20 years, it's literally impossible because we do not live in that kind of a world and that state of the economy. So the whole let's raise interest rates and let's do restrictive monetary policy, it doesn't solve the inflation because it's caused by deglobalization and a systemic change in the world. So the inflation we have is not a monetary or fiscal policy inflation. It is a structural inflation of a system going through a global restructuring. And this is the same in US, in Croatia, in Hungary. Now, if we look at past 20 years, just indulge the economic scientists, this is what was called the real business cycle theory. You basically had flat monetary policy, flat fiscal policy, and development based on rising productivity. Now, what did we have before, and what do we have now, and are going to have? Well, we had globalization, which kept the prices down. We had wages and real economy and employment growing, because if you look at a long-term trend, the employment's growing in the US and in Europe, and you had jobs moving from production to services. Well, as the proverb says, been there, done that, bought the t-shirt. This is the new one. Inflation will remain elevated. The main cause will come from supply side because we're no longer producing goods. Now, the answer to that, to some extent, is onshoring or friendshoring, but if you close a factory in China, it'll take you 2 or 3 years to build that same factory in your country, under the assumption you have the ability to do that, financing to do that, and labor to employ. And then the standard of living will decrease. That's a necessary consequence of high inflation. End of Act 1. Let's do an Act 2. In second part, we're going to talk a definition of what causes structural inflation. Number one, general disequilibrium. This is a breakdown of an economic system. We're not talking 2008. We're talking war. So we don't have that. Partial disequilibrium, we have this because of deglobalization. That's why you can't get chips. That's why I went to a car salon and I needed to change a piece on my car, and they said, we're going to take 7 weeks to get parts. What, 7 weeks to get a part for a car? External shock for smaller countries and even for groups of countries like European Union, this is what we have. And then the third part is expectations, which are going to go rise, and people will start to, although now expectations are that inflation will go down to 2%, another year of this, people will realize inflation is not going down. Now, here's the number one problem of the United States and a number one problem of the Western world. The Chinese want to rule the world. It's that simple. But if you read their books, the books they're based on 6 military classics. And if you read those books, it's all about time and planning. If you look, and I will demonstrate this through data, the current position of Western world, countries like Germany, countries like United States, is exceptionally vulnerable. Not just because of debt. You'll see that in two graphs. So here, yes, United States debt is high. But if you go back, someone will say, oh, but we had high debt in 1945. That's true. But let's look at this question. We have a rise of debt of about close to $7 trillion. Who bought it? Well, to a large extent, Fed bought it. That was known as quantitative easing. So the Fed bought about $3 trillion. Okay, let's do a better question. And this is where the weakness of the United States come in, and this is the number one problem the United States has, and it's unsolvable. Who did not buy it? The answer is foreigners. Now, before COVID, foreigners owned 40% of US debt. Now they own 30%, which means most of the US debt was absorbed by the US economy. Now, how long can you absorb internally 2 to 3 trillion worth of dollars of debt? 1 year? 2 years? What are you going to do after that? So the capacity for the United States to absorb its own debt is approaching the end. And this basically is the number one power BRICS has. Because if you look at the chart of the world, G7 cannot buy the US debt. They're also conducting restrictive monetary policy. BRICS doesn't want to. The rest of the world is not large enough. So, who is going to buy? Because think about it. US has a deficit approaching $2 trillion annually. Fed, through quantitative tightening, is releasing another $700 billion annually. So someone needs to buy $2.5 to $3 trillion of US debt annually. This is a G7 country in terms of size. So you do that once, your banking system, your pension funds, they buy it. 2022. You do that again, 2023. Who's going to buy that in 2024? And the answer is, the absorption of debt is not going to be a problem. Someone will always buy it. But there's a caveat, and that caveat has incredible long-term implications. You have to have a rising interest rate. So someone needs to buy debt at a higher interest rate. Now, what do higher interest rates mean? Well, if the United States is borrowing for 10 years at 5%, and then it has to borrow at 7%, that means when a corporation comes to the bank and says, I would like a loan to build a factory, it takes me 10 years, the interest rate is going to be higher than the government. So as the interest rates on US debt rise, the interest rates on all businesses rise. And that crushes investment, and that crushes economic growth. Now, to make things even worse, from a strategic point of view, everyone's talking about de-dollarization. Now, here's the deal. A lot of the people in the United States, and even the BRICS, have said that we do not want to replace the dollar. And that's true. You cannot replace the dollar. But you don't need to replace the dollar to destabilize the US economy. Currently, there are more United States dollars outside of United States than there is in United States. So if you look at dollar as a reserve currency, sure, it's going to remain a reserve currency because you have G7 countries. Japan's going to hold dollars. European Central Bank is going to hold dollars. Transactional currency, sure, a lot of the countries are going to do it. But think about it in these terms. Let's say INA, a Croatian oil company, has $100 in their account. And they use this dollar to buy oil and then make gasoline. Let's say they say now, oh, we don't need $100 anymore. We just need 80. What's going to happen with the $20? It's not going to float around in the world. It's going to go back to the source, which means the United States will have too much dollars, which means you will have to absorb it through a restrictive monetary policy even more. And that's the deal. So the BRICS want to decrease the use of dollars as a transactional currency in order to slowly erode the financial stability of the United States. And financial stability of the United States is also being eroded on the other front, but by foreigners not buying their debt, and on the third front, by having too much debt. So the only solution for this is fiscal consolidation, meaning you have to decrease your government spending. Now, given the political climate, what would be number one easiest thing to cut? You can't cut Medicaid because that's old people, which means you need to cut war spending. And that's how you do it. So the goals is to have a prolonged period of economic stagnation, inflation, and a decrease in economic standing. Now, this is a trick question because there's already has been answered. How not to do that? Well, by everything Professor Klaus talked about. By not restricting free markets, by not increasing regulation, by not making business more difficult. And what is the current legislation doing on both sides of the Atlantic? Exactly that. Nailed it. And in order to understand, as the great Admiral Thrawn said, in order to understand your enemy, you need to understand its culture. Thus, the highest form of combat is to attack the strategy. The next best is to destroy alliances. The next order is to attack the enemy's army in the field. And the worst policy is to besiege walls of cities. Sun Tzu. High debt combined with a decrease of economic power will erode the US and global position. And it'll happen slowly over time. There is a way out of it, clearly, as said, but it's not going to be done by the people in power. Now, what is the solution? Well, imagine if there was a group of people meeting in a castle, surrounded by rocks, and doing what should be right. As they're called in comic books, they're superheroes.
From one superhero to another, we've now got Catherine McBride, who has the misfortune to be an economist for the British Trade and Agricultural Commission, which must be a superhero's job, I should think.
Well, I'll do my best. Thank you. Yes, now I'm going to start with the sort of the economist creed. I am a free market economist, and I just want to say I do believe it lifted millions of people out of poverty. It's improved living standards for people all around the world, and we all have benefited from imported food and fuel and consumer goods, and it's all great. However, things are changing, and I must say I didn't get to see Nevin's speech before we started, but I think we're going to tag together quite well here. Of course, trade got distorted recently, and as we've already heard from President Klaus, it started with the European Union, who likes to impose tariffs and quotas and regulatory barriers and all sorts of things that make importing goods more expensive. But we've also got subsidised production coming from the other side, especially China, who, in order to gain market share and encourage dependency, are driving other competitors out of the market. And then, of course, we have a very perverse thing where many countries in the West are now artificially increasing their own costs with regulations and tariffs and taxes, which are benefiting imported goods. And often these are done as part of the green agenda, and I'll come to that later. But we do find that we are competing with other countries who are not following similar regulations and are not subject to the same taxes or duties or levies. Now, I think that's how I'm going to go. Sorry, I'll go back. All of this came to a head in 2022 when the world reopened after COVID and discovered that China hadn't reopened, and therefore we had a massive shortage of things like computer chips. And this affected all the production of cars in Europe and in the UK and in the US. And suddenly people began to realise that without a key component, and in terms of cars, the base computer chips that were coming from China were worth $600, and yet they were holding up the sales of cars worth tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. So everyone suddenly realised that by relying on very small, very insignificant parts, that this could hold up a whole production line. And it wasn't just computer chips, it was also the active ingredients in pharmaceuticals, and it was also the rare earth minerals which we use in fibre optics and which we use in the making of many of our mobile phones and our solar panels and things like that, which we've now made mandatory in the West. And the second thing that happened in 2022 is Russia invaded the Ukraine. And that is when Europe discovered that they had been relying on a very unreliable supplier of oil and gas. And the EU did what the EU always does, and they decided to impose sanctions on Russia. And the funny thing was, of course, that they'd still imposed, the same sanctions were already imposed on Russia from the time that Russia invaded Crimea in 2014. And they hadn't had, obviously, much effect then, and I don't think they'll have much effect now. The list of the things they've sanctioned is very long, and it's amusing to read it. It's not just goods and services, goods that we can't sell to Russia and also goods that we can't buy from them, but it also covers shipping and services and insurance, and it also enabled the West to freeze a lot of Russian assets and seize assets from Russian oligarchs. And all of that was great, but you will notice that crude oil was not sanctioned until December 2022, and refined petroleum products were not sanctioned until February of this year. So for all the huffing and puffing, one of the reasons that this didn't work was because the key components were not sanctioned at all. Russia's really exports three things. They export food and fuel and fertilizer. Those three things make up 60% of Russian exports, or they did before COVID. That's all of the things we seized from Russia, which was, I think that's what the West liked the most. Sorry, it spoils the next story. And by not sanctioning those three products, we had very little effect on Russia's ability to trade. And so even without the West buying other goods from Russia, they still managed to sell $130 billion worth of goods last year. So that if we really, and you will see that for the most part, both in gas and in petrol, it was really just rearranging how the world bought things. So in this is world gas production, and as you can see, it didn't seem to have much of a problem with our sanctions on Russia. And this is the gas prices, but this is oil production. So both oil and gas continued to be produced, and we tried to sanction Russia, but all it meant is that Russian oil was sold to India, and the oil that India would have bought maybe from Qatar got sold to Europe. And so everyone just changed partners, but we kept dancing. The thing that it did hit was the amount we had to pay for it. And this is average prices over the year. And what is fascinating is, so the average German import price of gas was 4 times the US Henry Hub price. The Henry Hub price is gaseous gas, the proper stuff, natural gas. Obviously, there's a lot of LNG comes in from the US, which is more expensive. So Europe and the UK were paying 4 times over the whole of 2022 for their gas. And this was incredibly important. In Germany, it's important for running their factories. In the UK, it's important for producing electricity, because the UK did something which was very good for the environment. We converted our coal-fired power stations into gas-fired power stations. But then we did something that was slightly insane, and we decided to stop using our own gas and import gas from other countries. This is primarily coming from Norway, but in the last few years, we've had to also import it from the US as liquid natural gas, which is a lot more expensive. And this is also why a lot of factories in Germany had to close, because it's very hard to compete with imports coming in from China, many of whom, as I said at the beginning, are being subsidized so that the West becomes dependent on them. And suddenly you find the playing field is very, very unlevel, to use a EU term. So there's oil and there's gas, and this is actually what happened on the price. So even though on average it was 4 times as expensive as the US, this is the Dutch TTF price of gas, and you can see at one point it was over 8 times more expensive. And that was purely because it's much easier to have gas coming in a pipeline directly from Russia. And Germany didn't even have terminals to offload liquid natural gas last year. They have got to and built them very, very quickly, I must say. But for a long time, the UK became a land bridge, if you like, for liquid natural gas, which was coming from the US, vaporized in the UK, put into the pipes that connect into Europe. But while the EU, or all of Europe, in fact, realised how being dependent on Russia maybe wasn't our smartest move for something as important as gas, on the other side of the Atlantic, the US was beginning to realise that being dependent on China for as important things as silicon chips, rare earth minerals, and active ingredients in pharmaceuticals also wasn't particularly smart. So, like everyone else in the world, the US has realised this was a mistake, and they are now trying to start chip production in the US, and they are onshoring chips and friendshoring them, which means that countries like Mexico and Canada and also Australia have been included in Biden's CHIPS Act, which is putting $52 billion of subsidy into onshoring semiconductor factories. But the problem is this will probably be done in a Western way, and there'll be no obligation for those chips to be sold to US producers. The Chinese government, on the other hand, owns 40% of China's semiconductor production. So when China makes semiconductors, they are able to ensure that they are used for Chinese uses. And I'll get to that later. We are seeing that now more. The EU doesn't want to be outdone by the US, so they also have their own CHIPS Act, and they are putting 43 billion euros into various programs of getting chips made in the EU. They want to increase their market share, their global market share, from 10% to 20%. And the EU, being slightly more Chinese in its outlook, is making factories that must have some portion of their production must be dedicated to EU producers. And they are encouraging companies to make their own chip fabrications as well. And then just when you thought this was the end of it, South Korea has also decided to put tax breaks and R&D credits to the tune of $65 billion over the next 3 years to ensure their place in leading the world's semiconductor production. And even India is now offering $1 billion for every new fabrication plant that's established in India. So computer chips are coming home, whether we like them or not. Many people are predicting this will cause a glut in computer chips. But when you see all production fall over on a missing part, or a tiny missing part, or a cheap missing part, you realise that this is now as essential to US manufacturing and European manufacturing as its gas supply from Russia. And the same thing is happening with rare earths, which are not particularly rare, they're just very dilute in the ground that they're found. So they have to go through a refining process. And this refining process is not only expensive, it's very polluting. And one of the reasons it doesn't happen in the West is because of our own environmental laws. Now, many people want to bring rare earth refining back to the US, and there are really only 2 companies that are doing this, an Australian company called Lynas Rare Earths and a US company called MP Minerals. But it's very hard to find a place where you can set up a factory refining these minerals and not run into or be contrary to the environmental regulations of that area. A cleverer thing, which has been suggested by Elon Musk, would be if we develop better technology. Rather than just try and compete with China, we have to change the technology and move to something that doesn't require rare earths. He suggested changing them for a thing called ferrite, which is a ceramic oxide. It's cheaper and resistant to corrosion. And I think that might end up being a better solution than trying to bring rare earths back to the West. But there's another side to this thing, is what actually happens to China? Could it cut itself off from the West? Because a lot of people are talking about how, and China is being controlling in the fact that when it used to sell us the chips and it used to sell us the rare earths so that we could make our own cars, they're now trying to sell us the cars, and they're now trying to sell us the solar panels, and they don't want to sell us the parts anymore. And this is very clever vertical integration from China's point of view. But this will also make it more difficult for Western factories to compete on the present terms that we have set up. And one thing that may undermine China is that we are their customers. And the Chinese population have become used to us being their customers, and we employ a huge number of people in China, whether we realise it or not. And as you can see here, this is Chinese imports by area. And though the BRICS talk a big game, when you look at it, the BRICS are not a big part of supplying China with anything at the moment. And even the BRICS Plus, which is the inclusion of the new BRICS, which you'll see in the darker orange, is only slightly higher. It gets to about 20%. Where the what I call the high-tech Asian triangle, which is Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, plus the US and Australia, are supplying the US with up to 40% of their goods, China up to 40% before COVID. That's dropped to about 35%, but I suspect that will probably come back again. The other change is if the West does stop dealing with China, is a lot of Chinese people will be not only unemployed, but they have grown used to getting goods from China. Over the last 20 years, meat from Australia, they buy meat and barley from Australia, lamb and butter from New Zealand, rice and fish from Vietnam, pork and wheat from Canada, soy from the US. And these imports have gone up by 4,000% for meat, 4,400% for cereals, including rice, 3,400% for fruit and nuts, 2,700% for dairy products and eggs, and 1,000% for fish and seafoods. So the idea that the Chinese population would ignore losing the supply of food from the West, or losing their jobs because the West is not buying whatever they're making anymore, is possibly something that we should consider. Someone that I've met a few times, a professor at Harvard, who is a Sino watcher, she believes that China's biggest fear is not the US military, but it's its own population. And I think that while we do all fear that China will walk away or dominate us economically, we always have to remember that we can move our custom. We are the customer and they are relying on us. Because if we look at the next slide, these are Chinese exports. And again, that little triangle and the US and Australia is buying a lot more from China than the BRICS Plus or the BRICS alone. In fact, the US buys as much from China as all of the BRICS, the original BRICS. And what I found most interesting about this chart was the fact that the BRIC are going down. Their heyday was 2013. They're buying less stuff from China. So, in fact, that sort of makes, if China is trying to realign itself with these economies, it may need to find someone else to buy its goods. The other thing that China relies on heavily is, of course, ores, which is mainly iron ore, but also copper ore and aluminium. And their biggest supplier is clearly Australia. And again, all of the BRICS added together, including the new ones, are dropping off the field. What they do supply China with is oil. And it is interesting that they have included in the new BRICS both Saudi and Iran. And they are supplying China with about 40% of its oil. So that may be what they're doing in terms of aligning themselves with those. But in terms of people supplying us with goods, we are now seeing that the new powerhouses are no longer China. China's trade intensity, which is trade as a proportion of its GDP, has been falling from 64% in 2006 to just 38% this year. But Vietnam, Mexico, the Philippines, and India are the new powerhouses of production. And interestingly, 3 of those countries are already members of trading blocs. So Vietnam is part of the CPTPP, Mexico is part of the USMCA, obviously, and India is one of the BRICS, i.e. the I in the BRICS. So, and the Philippines is the odd man out, but of course it has always been traditionally very close to the US. So again, I think that the US could easily start moving manufacturing not so much back to the US, but to other low-cost producers and come out of this quite well off. But there are downsides to onshoring or friendshoring. And the biggest problem is you have a government picking winners. When the governments go in and put 50 billion, 65 billion towards onshoring chip manufacturing, they may not be paying for the best technology. It may be last year's technology. They may not be the best companies. One of the benefits of free markets is that the people who should win, will win. And unfortunately, when governments start subsidising things, as someone once said to me, bad companies pick good governments rather than good governments picking bad companies. And I think that might be true. The other thing that is a problem is many former industrial cities in the US and certainly in the UK have reinvented themselves, and they've gone into clean, high-tech industries, and they probably won't want to have dirty, polluting steel making back on their doorsteps. And we've got to work out how we get around our present environmental laws to onshore that, or how we cope with it, because we have benefited enormously from having China do a lot of this stuff, which is not only making our steel, but they also recycle our garbage. That was a huge industry for China until a few years ago. Also, obviously cost, which we've talked about. Reshoring industries will be more expensive, not only to build the factory, but also the ongoing cost. And then our regulation. Many of our regulations will actually prevent this from happening. We've got to look at how we are regulating things. Our ESG rules, which Professor Klaus and I agree on completely, will make it difficult to fund a lot of these industries because a lot of big investors and insurance companies in London are following ESG rules, and they are not, the easiest way for them to get brownie points for ESG is to not fund anything that is involved in oil and gas or steel making. Finally, but I do believe, and I think this is very important, and as we've heard before, this infrastructure has to be onshored. There isn't another answer to this. We cannot continue to rely on our enemies to supply us with the absolutely essential parts. And some of them, such as the rare earths, are essential in our defence equipment. It was said earlier by the earlier group that the US is now talking loudly and carrying a small stick. Well, there's a corollary to that. They are carrying a small stick that was made in China. And that is the problem. And I think we do have to think about that.
Well, that was, we had three, tremendous presentations there. If I could just sort of open it up for discussion a bit and come back to what seems to be a general point, that free markets are better than any alternative. At the same time, we seem to have moved into a world where, as Catherine said, we have to create resilience against hostile powers, particularly the rise of China. Now, if we came back to the 1990s, that golden era when history had ended and we lived in a Zeit without Geist, it was the idea that, the world was on a path where the Western model, if you read Tony Blair's rather interesting biography, A Journey, he says, the West had already won, that the world was following a path that the West dictated towards the happy land of polyarchy, liberal democracy. And part of that was the market economy. So in the 1980s, Reagan and Thatcher and the open market policies they promoted had generated a condition where market economies were the most successful democracies on the planet ever. And Thatcher said somewhere that we know how to generate wealth. Well, we seem to have, been able to forget how to generate wealth very quickly. And one of the arguments posed why free market economics are not very popular even in conservative circles these days is that one of the things that occurred, which as Michael Anton, pointed out earlier, was that it was generally assumed that if we opened our markets and traded with East Asian economies, particularly economies like China, gave them technology, allowed them to develop, they would liberalize and it would be a win-win game all round. One of the reasons we are now facing our problems with China is that under WTO rules, which China was allowed to operate under, China doesn't obey WTO rules. And yet we're still sort of following an open market policy, which is actually, as Catherine said, no longer a level playing field. So can you be a free market in the kind of conditions we currently face? So I'll pose that to you, Professor, first, and then maybe circulate the question.
First, I was, of course, proclaiming after the Velvet Revolution 1989 that we won the market economy, won, and so on and so on. But I must say that I was always cautious. You know? I knew that the victory was so-so, that the victory was with a very small margin. I have been confronted with so many opponents that I know that it was very fragile to proclaim that victory, which I think is a wrong idea. And Fukuyama was absolutely misplaced and wrong. And we lost again. That's my general feeling. And so that's one sentence. Second sentence, may I have a comment on Professor Vidakovic? You know, the economists, as Professor Vidakovic and me, and Katarina, are usually ridiculed and caricatured and I don't know what, you know, by the better people. I mean, by politicians, journalists, sociologists, philosophers, and so on, that we know just two words, demand and supply. You know. We know even some other words. Nevertheless, in some respect, this description is a correct one. When I was listening to Professor Vidakovic's very, very clear argumentation, I understood that he is fully on the supply side. I, on the contrary, stress the demand side. You speak about the deglobalization as the main reason for for restraining the supply side. I am speaking about the entitlement economy. I speak about the Anspruchgesellschaft in German, you know, that something on the demand side, in my understanding, is really much worse. So that's my short comment. And the third one, Professor, why do you use the term of innocent journalists, globalization and deglobalization? This is an empty term, you know. Let's talk about the increasing or decreasing internationalization of the economy. That's a neutral term, but globalization leads immediately to the idea when it is global, it leads to globalism. It leads to the necessity to control the world from above and so on. So the term globalization has a very negative aspect in itself. So let's talk again in a standard terminology about increasing internationalization or decreasing internationalization. Let's forget the term globalization. It's a misused term.
We both use that term, so over to you.
Okay. We're basically talking about two different problems. I was referring to the fact that we have a problem with the supply side, that if we're not producing something and we're depending on China, that needs to be changed. Everything you said about the problem of the demand side, I didn't go into, but it absolutely holds, and I agree with you. And I think to a large extent, the politicians are trying to fix the supply side problem with the demand side and vice versa through subsidies. So it's not that I disagree with anything, or I don't think you disagree with me on this point. It's just that we were talking about two different problems that are equally important, because I agree with you that if we have a problem in economics, we cannot say, okay, the government needs to solve it by putting money somewhere, and if it doesn't have money, it can just increase its budget. That goes on indefinitely, and nothing ever good comes out of it. So I think that we have both identified exactly the same problem. In terms of the word, yeah, I agree with you in terms on geoeconomics. It's a abstract term. Globalization, I agree with you, it's a catchphrase. The issue of if we really stick to the professor type of internalization, I agree with you that would be a more precise terms that can put every country in a relation of how open it is, to whom it is open, both on a local, European and a global level. So I will follow the advice of my elders and make those corrections.
I Okay. I would suggest you're right, because it starts off as globalization, as if we all do it. But as Ricardo suggested in the 1820s, that eventually trade will move to the most efficient supplier. He probably assumed that would be a fair supplier. But of course, if a country is subsidizing their supply, then they can take over a global market share without being necessarily the most efficient. They're just that their government is willing to subsidise it until they've got control of the market. And we've seen that happen. Even Ricardo would not have wanted the UK to become reliant on Napoleonic France for some goods, though he believed entirely in free trade. So I think we're at that situation now where we have to start trading with our friends, keep our friends close rather than our enemies.
Well, I am trying to use the well-defined terminology, because, after the fall of communism, our fight was, let's say, for free markets, not for globalization. There are many experts and very clever people who are against free markets, but in favor of globalization. That's something very relevant which we have to pay attention to, because I am sure that under the term globalization are hidden very negative thinkers and ideas and approaches. So let's pay attention to the term globalization. I always discussed it and criticized it.
That's very wise, actually. Can we thank...